What was happening in France while British aristocrats were building these little gems for their private estates? London was by no means a model urban city in the early 19th century, as the aristocracy inhabited their rural estates and had little concern about where the commoners lived. Meanwhile, Paris was the heart of urbanity in Europe at this time. First of all, the aristocracy has been, for the most part, eliminated by the Revolution, so in Paris we are left with a more middle-class based society, and Paris will continue to be the black hole of France, sucking more and more people to it as they leave the countryside and move to town, a process that Louis XIV had initiated by forcing the country's aristocrats to move to Versailles. So what was the condition of Paris in the upper left at the time of the Revolution, which was actually more of a civil war? The streets are unpaved. We don't have sewers. There are horses running every which way, and there are no stoplights, so they are careening through the streets. They're accompanied with their urine and crap. We have human urine and crap on the streets, all sorts of animals living as well as dead. And then it rains or snows, and of course it's cold, a nice cold downpour. Get the picture, or should I say the smell? Eventually what will happen is the French will start building porticos over the sidewalks, like in the upper right, for protection from the rain and sun. But what we are really looking for is the bottom image, the suburban shopping mall. This comes from Paris. It is called the Passage. In English, the Arcade. The first one was built in 1781, so actually it was 8 years before the start of the Revolution. Here we have the Valley girls standing around, flirting with the jocks, exchanging their best hit lines. Nothing's really changed, has it? The only thing that has changed over the years is that they now have cell phones. The first arcade was built by the Duc d'Orléans, the title given to the next person in line to become king if the king had failed to produce an heir to succeed him. At his residence, the Palais Royal, or the Royal Palace, he had this huge palace, but still needed money to maintain it, so he asked King Louis XVI permission to make it into a shopping mall that will eventually have over 145 shops, restaurants, and salons. Its configuration is an open courtyard whose perimeter is lined with shops. What the Duke has proposed is to build a fourth portico that will have shops, that it's marked with the arrow down in the lower right, and that will enclose the courtyard that you see here. On the left is what it originally looked like, and on the right, how it looks today. In 1786, the Marquis de Bombelle recorded, "There were more than enough shops in the Palais Royal arcades to supply everything one needs for appearance, as well as a host of coffee houses, public baths, restaurants and caterers, hotels, social gathering spectacles, paintings, books, and concerts. In a single day, and without leaving its precincts, one can buy as prodigiously much in the way of luxury goods as one would manage in a year in any other locality." In 1786, the Duke added the Galerie Dubois, as you see here, still under construction in the top, creating a closed courtyard. Quote, booksellers, jewelers, milliners, shops for blackening shoes with a covered seat and a newspaper to read during the operation, coffee houses, restaurants, gaming rooms, night cellars, etc. abound. A narrow piazza runs around 3 sides of the great square of the building, in which people of all sorts are perpetually moving. Many loose women parade in the piazza, who by their dress and manners sufficiently express their character, but are under a proper restraint so far as not to interrupt or molest or address any person who does not give them encouragement. Well, just isn't that sweet? I was told the police were very strict in this respect. So we have the first urban shopping mall in Paris just before the start of the Revolution. Very quickly, this is going to evolve into the Parisian building type known as the Passage, or in English, the Arcade. This is an example of a post-revolution passage that we are talking about. A covered walkway or passage, typically a shortcut through a block, that is lined on both sides with shops and then covered by this great iron and glass language that the British have been paralleling in their development for plants. So while the British aristocracy will use iron and glass on their rural estates for plants, the French middle class are going to use it for people. So we've got people versus plants. The same building type being used by two completely different cultures for different purposes, with one important difference. While the British greenhouse is a freestanding object, the French iron and glass roof is typically placed between two masonry storefronts that can provide rigidity for it. And why will this typology multiply so fast in Paris? Because this is your choice. The Paris street or the Paris Passage. Which one would you want to spend an afternoon shopping in? 24 of these are going to be built in Paris in the next 20 years, most of which still exist today. Why is that? Just imagine it's a cold, rainy day in February. And of course, anyone in France can walk the streets. In other words, some people may just not be able to afford to wear perfume like you can. So just imagine what the street would smell like. So you really don't want to run around with that type of crowd now, do you? Meanwhile, what does the Passage offer you? Well, of course, it offers you protection. First of all, you can control who can enter and who does not. Somebody who stinks or just doesn't look right, they can't come in. It's a controlled environment that really makes urban life great for those who are let in. So then, here you are. You get a little lunch and maybe a glass of wine. A perfect afternoon. The first major post-revolution passage was the Passage Des Panoramas in 1799. What is a panorama? It's a movie theater, right? In the US, they were called cycloramas. So over 200 years ago, the French had shopping malls with movie theaters. And we Americans think that we invented everything, right? What is a panorama? It's a 360-degree cylindrical painting. That's as close to a movie that they could get at this time. We still have a couple existing in the United States. This is the one in Atlanta, about the Battle of Atlanta. To get into it, you walk underneath and come up into the center, where a gallery gives you a 360-degree viewing platform. And right in front of you, there are three-dimensional, full-size statues that blend seamlessly into the two-dimensional painting of the mural beyond. This is as close as they can get to a movie at this point in time. And so in Paris at this time, they have their version of a suburban, I should say urban shopping mall, including two movie theaters. There is one at each end. So in 1799, we have the good life. I'll meet you at the Cheesecake Factory at 1 o'clock, okay? So this is what a passage typically looks like. There is a skylight over it, and there are cafes and shops running up and down the sidewalk. What we're seeing is a development of a whole new urban lifestyle. The French will call it le flaneur, the urban stroller or urban observer. You just stroll along the city, especially in the Passage because it's convenient and pleasant. If you have visited Paris, you know that it is quite pleasurable to simply walk along the streets. Woody Allen got this one right in Midnight in Paris. So I would like to show you just a couple of these passages. Again, you can see where we're going. We saw Soufflot with the stairway at the Louvre take away all of the masonry and just use iron to support a glass roof. So that's what the French are going to do. Set up the masonry walls for rigidity and then span the space with their iron and glass. Did you see any stone in the later British greenhouses like Chatsworth? No. There must be something the British have that is different than the French in these early iron structures. Yes, and this is called cast iron, because the French are almost always going to need a stone exterior for rigidity, whereas the British will not. So the contrast between the British and the French should strike you. The British are building these buildings for only rich people's estates in the middle of nowhere for their plants. The French are erecting the same exact building in the city for people. The British aristocrats don't give a damn about the city. They have their rural manor, that's their focus, their life. It is a highly rural culture. Whereas in France, all the rural aristocrats were neutralized, if not outright killed, so it is only the city dweller who's left, right? Other than the farmers in the countryside. So we have a highly urban architectural typology in France versus a highly rural architectural form in Britain. Here's one of my favorites, the Galerie Vivienne from 1823. The exterior looks exactly like this, but sometimes I like to use period images better than color. Like all real estate investments, they periodically have to be updated to stay in fashion. And when I want color, I will give you color, right? This Passage is still immaculate today. You can see why there was such a draw by these spaces, especially in the first half of the 19th century. Its interiors are clean, they are dry when it is raining, you are not freezing your buns off when it is cold, and it is drop-dead gorgeously detailed. And so you have this battle between the owners of these galleries trying to outdo one another with all of their furniture and their plants and their finishes. I particularly like the Galerie Kolb built in 1826. It dead ends in a cul-de-sac that has with a rotunda that is covered by a glass and iron radial skylight. In 1830, the Galerie Dubois at the Royal Palais was replaced with the Galerie d'Orléans. In the image at the upper right, you can see the old timber gallery being replaced by the new iron and glass Galerie d'Orléans. Sooner or later, however, an architect is going to take this vocabulary and put it in a building other than a shopping mall. That's what we're looking for. When do we start to transfer this technology to other building types? It happens late in the game, actually, in 1843. It occurs in the design of a library. We've seen manuscript collections in Gothic abbeys and so on, but we really don't have a freestanding building typology of the library at this point in time. So I'm introducing you now to the Bibliothèque Sainte-Geneviève by Henri Labrouste, just across the street from Soufflot's church. What he's going to do is to put two of these glass and iron barrel vaults side by side over the space, basically creating a forest of trees that you're sitting under the canopy of their branches as you read. In 1843, Labrouste gives us a very iconic building that American architects are going to use as a precedent in their work during the second half of the 19th century. So I need to set up the concept for you. First, it is a very straightforward building, going back again to what Soufflot said was his goal. He wanted to merge the monumentality of the classical vocabulary with the structural interior openness of Gothic as a true French style. In 1843, Labrouste gives us a very iconic building that American architects are going to use as a precedent in their work during the second half of the 19th century. So I need to set up the concept for you. First, it is a very straightforward building, going back again to what Soufflot said was his goal. He wanted to merge the monumentality of the classical vocabulary with the structural interior openness of Gothic as a true French style. Secondly, he wants to get the reading room as high as possible so he can maximize the daylight coming into the building. So he put the reading room on the floor above the ground, which is commonly referred to as a piano nobile, or where the noble residents reside. Literally, in Italian, it means noble floor. One more detail. Note the triple windows under the arches. This guy knows how to detail an arch, going back to the Roman Thermae window. You do not put a support right under the middle of an arch, right? If you do, you don't need an arch. He breaks the opening into thirds. This guy really knows his stuff. Le Brusque's design is going to be symmetrical, for other than the Gothic and Neo-Gothic, we are not going to get into asymmetrical buildings until after 1900. So we should find the entrance, as we do, right in the center. And so you come into a forest of columns, under the canopy of knowledge, if you will, and he brings you all the way across to the rear of the building, where he can locate the stairs without messing up his front facade. And then he's going to bring you upstairs, climbing a hill, if you will. You must work to gain enlightenment. You then enter the back of the reading room, where he opened up the walls for as much light as possible. But for acoustics, he has separated the stairway from the reading room with a door. It is as if you are faced with another entrance, in which you are then compressed with a low ceiling so as to release you as you explode into this glorious light-filled space of the reading room. Iron allows him to make the columns as small as possible, but note that he still conservatively puts them on pedestals rather than bringing them straight to the floor. These may be the first freestanding iron columns in French architecture, only 75 years after the British had first used them in St. Anne's in Liverpool. It's kind of a rational space because it's nothing but structure and windows, right? So he's got the Gothic logic and space of the interior now married with the formal monumentality of classicism on the exterior. And of course he is now using iron, the new material, but only on the interior. We are never going to see iron on the outside of a French building. That is simply not acceptable, nor considered fireproof by Paris's very strict fire code. So by 1846, both of these buildings are done. And again, how much more contrast do you want between the French use of this material and the British? The French build urban buildings, and the British build rural buildings. I have a building for people, and I have a building for plants. The British have an iron building that has sufficient rigidity to brace itself, while the French iron structure needs its masonry exterior to give it lateral stability against wind loads, because of the quality of French iron can't quite detail the connections that the British can pull off with their cast iron at this point in time. Finally, in that year, 1846, the British erect an urban greenhouse for commoners, the Regents Park Winter Garden, designed by Richard Turner, who had just completed the Palm House at Kew Gardens. You can see in the lower left his signature stained glass pilasters. Meanwhile, the French continued to expand Paris's artificial urban life by erecting their own winter garden. This is the Jardin De Ville, the winter garden, by Hector Hérault on the Champs-Élysées. It was critically judged to be inadequate and within a year was torn down and rebuilt in 1847. The replacement, also designed by Hérault, was over 300 feet long and 60 feet tall and some 100 feet wide. It had 2 levels you could walk along. Along the perimeter one could stroll, encountering carts that sold bonbons and other delights. And then there was an English garden down the center, where there were ponds with fish and cages with birds. Here is another view of the Jardin, and what really blows your mind is when you realize that all the walls are mirrors, so the space is at least doubled in your perception. So I think we've accomplished what we set out to do at the beginning of this lecture. We have achieved the glories of ancient Rome with the new vocabulary of iron by 1848, right? So I can juxtapose the baths of Diocletian with the Jardin de Ville easily because they have similar forms as well as similar functions. But the French don't stop here because they have a new industry called the railroad. So they need to design and build railroad stations, another new building typology. This is the Gare de l'Est, the East Station in Paris. Again, an exterior of monumental classical stone, but once again the architect is rationally showing you what's on the interior with this large central glazed arch. that expresses the train shed in front of which the architect has placed an appropriately sized monumental lobby that leads directly to the train shed that is designed as a monumental iron and glass passage that shelters the trains coming in and out as well as their passengers. It is completed early in 1848, the year of revolutions, when all of Europe is aflame with people trying to gain more control over their lives from the aristocracy. It begins in France and spreads throughout continental Europe. In France, the radicals are eventually put down by the conservatives, who elect a government led by Napoleon's nephew, Louis Napoleon, who will eventually lead a coup d'etat in 1851 and become Emperor Napoleon III. He will succeed for the next 20 years in changing Paris into a modern 19th century city. In this achievement, he will be aided by Baron Georges Haussmann, who Napoleon will appoint as the prefect of the Seine, which is, for all practical purposes, the Duke of Paris. What he says goes. We will look at the new Paris of the Second Empire in Lecture 20. Well, the British can't let the French outgun them in architecture, and so this brings us really to the high point of this entire lecture, the 1851 World's Fair, for which there is a competition to build the largest building ever constructed in history. Now, just how would you react to such a competition when you have only 13 months to not only design but also construct such a building? For the British government had just kept putzing around the issue until just a year before the intended opening day, when they finally announced the competition. There were over 100 entries, but nothing was really buildable within a year. The two leading experts with cast iron, Britain's Richard Turner, having just completed Kew Gardens, and Hector Hérault, having just completed the Jardin De Ville, are given honorable mentions. But Hérault's monumental masonry structure could not have been erected in time, and Turner's design required more iron than Britain's industry produced in a year. So a committee was given the task to design the structure, and they came back with this option. Again, too much brick and not enough iron production, a seemingly unsolvable problem, and that was when the genius of Joseph Paxton came to the rescue. Paxton, you will remember, is the gardener for the Duke of Devonshire, where he had erected the first large greenhouse at Chatsworth some 14 years earlier, so he was very well connected with the aristocracy, a critical point in Britain at this time. This is the famous Inkblot sketch that he drew in a restaurant while meeting with a representative of the media, showing what he would do if he had the project. The only way we're going to get this done in 12 months is to use a repetitive system, a system in which he has incorporated the need for modularity in an industrial-produced building. You can see that what he basically sketched is a big sister to what he had used at Chatsworth. The drawing at the top shows what he originally had intended. With his political connections and the fact that he and the contractor had guaranteed that it would be built by opening day, they were eventually awarded the project, but not before the government frittered away another 3 critical months. So that by the time Paxton was finally given the commission, he had only 9 months to erect the largest building ever attempted, so that it could also be filled for showtime. The final erected building varied in only one aspect from the original design. The fair was slated to be located in Hyde Park, just west of Buckingham Palace, i.e., where the rich people lived. It was all well and good to use the park for one summer, but we expect that it'll be returned to us in its pristine condition immediately after the fair, meaning not only no trees were to be cut, but after the end of the fair, you had 3 months to remove the world's largest building. The one change that was added to Paxton's original design was this vault in the center that's perpendicular to the axis of the building in order to cover the existing trees so that they didn't have to be torn down. Quite frankly, I think it improved the functional shed-like quality of Paxton's design. Just to give you a feeling of the size of this behemoth, its length was symbolically 1,851 feet long, actually 1848, an even number with the system that he used. That's 6 football fields long. If you include the end zones and seats, it would be over 3 stadiums long. Unbelievable. The building's floor plan shows you how the main transept not only sheltered the trees, but also acted as a main entry. Here is the system that he used that allowed him to build the building so quickly. Single-story iron columns with a 3-foot connector upon which is set another column. These are placed on a 24-foot module with a 3-foot deep truss that spans and is diagonally braced. Everything is friction connected together. The floors are wood joists and decking. In the next lecture, we will focus on the actual color pattern of the building and how it was chosen. The trusses were lifted into place by horses, then positioned into the 3-foot connector piece, and finally friction wedges were hammered into the joint to rigidize the connection between the truss and the columns. Here is the procedure of how the glue-laminated wood arches were erected. A pair of arches was first fabricated into a rigid assembly that was then lifted into place by the brute power of horses. The process had to be carefully choreographed per the sequence shown in the upper left, because the arch assembly was naturally wider than the space it spanned, so one side of the assembly had to be pulled up and in between the columns. Eventually, the structure would have to be glazed. These are the largest pieces of glass that could be made at the time, and I really don't even want to count how many pieces of glass there were, but again, the process had to be mechanized to save time and money. The process involved 4 men on these trams that ran on rails that are going back and forth. The first pair puts down the asphalt that seals the joint, and then the second pair actually puts the glass in place, and they just keep moving down the rails, placing 2 panes at a time. The building was not, by any stretch of the imagination, all cast iron. First, the British iron industry was not big enough to produce this much cast iron in the allotted time, and this is where Paxton saved the day because he was a pragmatist, not a purist. As he had used wood for the arches in Chatsworth some 14 years earlier, he again employed it not only in the arched ribs that spanned the 72 feet over the trees, as well as in the floors, but also in the curtain wall that held the glass windows. In other words, only the building's columns and trusses were actually cast iron. Paxton and his contractors succeeded, against all odds, in completing the building and having it ready for Queen Victoria to open on May 1st, 1851. The fair was a huge success, and its many exhibits revealed the changes the Industrial Revolution was bringing to the world, for better and for worse. The Crystal Palace was famous, but contrary to what some historians still claim today, I want you to remember that it was not the first iron and glass building. After all, I have shown you iron buildings from 1775, so I want you to view the Crystal Palace as the pinnacle achievement of 75 years of experimentation with iron and glass construction. But it was not the first iron and glass structure, if for no other reason than much of the building, as we have seen, was made with wood. So this also means that it was also not a structural achievement, as it was wood, not iron, that spanned the 72-foot nave over the trees. It was, however, both a constructional and an aesthetic achievement. Contrary to the solid, opaque architecture of the past, it presented a transparent, almost ephemeral interior that Humphrey Repton had first published in 1816 that now gave architects the option to conceive of a building in neither the classical nor the Gothic style, that J.C. Luton had predicted in 1817. And I want you to remember that the Crystal Palace was built 10 years before the start of the American Civil War.